So I love John's gospel. I used to hate it. I used to think Jesus was just so full of himself. He's just so sure about everything all the time, and I hated John's gospel. I was more of a Markan Jesus kind of person who's like struggling and striving and trying to figure out what God's all about and asking these questions. What do you want from me? Because it felt like me. And I'm finding that I am getting more excited about John's Jesus because of the certainty of the sovereignty of God. And I'm finding that, I've done a lot of wrestling in my life. I've done a lot of searching and striving and trying to figure it out. And I am ready to just say, I trust you. Here I am, Lord, send me. I am ready. Well, who knows if you're ready? I'm ready to be made ready. That's what I like to say. I'm ready to be made ready, because who knows if I'm ready? And you never know if you're ready until you're there, right? So we just try to be ready to be made ready. There's a lot of things I could say about this text, but the thing I'm going to just say right up front is how ironic this text is, right? There's all this breaching the fourth wall in John's gospel. There's all this like talking to the camera, right? Do-do-do-do-do, talk to the camera, do-do-do-do-do. It's a Mel Brooks movie. And there's this irony here, right? That the raising of Lazarus coming back to life means we got to kill Jesus, right? But then killing Jesus is going to lead Jesus to come back to life, which is going to lead to all this crazy stuff happening in the world, and people are going to start believing and trusting in God. You saw that I did a word switch there. I like the word trust as a translation of the word pistis or pisteo, which is the Greek word there that's often translated believe. I've talked about this a million times, but I just want to name it. You can look it up and learn more if you want. But this text is just so fascinating because it shows the logic of one dies for the nation, which makes sense, but it also undermines its own logic by saying, well, yeah, that's going to happen, and all these things that you thought you were holding on to, they're all going to pass away, right? The reader knows that Jerusalem is leveled by this time. The reader knows that Caiaphas, he's nothing at this time. In fact, it's so ironic that it even says in the text here, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Well, you're supposed to be made high priest for life. It's like being a Supreme Court justice. But we all know that who really runs things in Jerusalem? Do the priests run things? Do the Jews run things? Does Herod run things? No, who runs things? Caesar runs things, Rome runs things, Pilate runs things. And if you start saying stuff that Pilate doesn't like, are you high priest anymore? No, you are no longer on the DOGE. Thank you. And so these leaders are trying to preserve their positions of power. It's even in the Greek, it's very clear that when they say, the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation, it's possessive of the leadership. It's not our holy place and our nation as Jewish people. It's our location and status as people on top, or really kind of like low middle in the pyramid of empire. They are not on top. Absolutely not. They are very subject to lots of other layers above them. But, they've got their little hill, right? That's theirs, and they want to possess it and control it. And when somebody's going around resurrecting people, what's the one tool empire has and uses with great frequency in order to maintain its role as being on top?
Fear of death.
Yes, the fear of death. Scapegoatism is another way, but violence, the fear of death, that is how they win. That is the logic of empire. The logic of empire is violence and death. And if you can resurrect people, empire doesn't have any teeth anymore. See, I'll tell you, I just spent a week with the Jesuits. I was studying at Jesuit School of Theology, taking a class on multicultural education, and I've had lots of conversations with non-Catholic people about the celibacy of the priesthood. A lot of people have a lot of feelings about the celibacy of the priesthood. Let me tell you the core reason that I believe that the celibacy of the priesthood was so important for the church. because then you knew that at any moment you could give your life for the work against empire. You didn't have a family you were responsible by God to care for. You didn't have somebody that was depending on you for resources or income. It was a way to protect so that you wouldn't leave widows and orphans who are beloved of God. That you knew that your life was committed. You didn't have any wealth. You didn't have nothing. So that you were ready when the church said there is empire coming and they are going to kill us, that you would stand in the front. I think back to the civil rights movement. I think back to all of those Catholic priests who were standing and walking in the front, who were getting the hell beaten out of them.
This has been abused, though, you have to mention.
Of course. But the purpose of it was because they knew that the tool that empire has is violence. And so how are we going to respond without producing more violence? We're going to raise up people who are ready to stand in the breach. I could talk more about that, but I'm not going to. Here's the thing I know. Here's the thing I know about those men who made those kinds of commitments. That when our identity is in Jesus Christ, there is always a future. And what the chief priests and the Pharisees couldn't see is they couldn't see a future without their power. They couldn't see a future without their control. They couldn't see a future without their leadership. And we always have a future when our identity is in Jesus. Now, that being said, there's this quote in Scripture that I'm sure you have heard, which says, all things work for good for those who love God. And you're kind of like, how long a time frame are we talking about here, right? Because some things just don't seem to. And there's even this suggestion in this text that is happening, right? That this irony that John is lifting up is saying that the leaders couldn't help but be part of the salvation plan of God. They couldn't help but be part of lifting Jesus up. That even their preoccupation with maintaining their own power is only going to lead to the loss of their power, right? There's a logic here. And I do believe, because I've seen this, that death does clarify some things about our identities. Now, I've done a number of memorial services in my life, and I want to tell you about one, and I tell this story a lot. I did a memorial service once for a matriarch of a family. She was the last of her generation, and she had, I think, 3 kids and quite a few grandkids. And when I met with the family, I had to have 2 meetings with the family. One with one part of the family, and a meeting with the other part of the family. Because guess what? The only time they ever deign to talk to each other or be in the same room together is when they put it down at Nana's house. The only time they will be in relationship at all is out of respect for the matriarch. And both families came to me and said, you know, we're grieving the loss of Nana, but the reality is, after this, I'm never going to see my brother again. After this, I'm never going to see my nieces and nephews again. This is where the family breaks. And it was a really hard memorial service because everybody loved her and they were grieving something bigger than her. They were grieving the unity that she represented. And I think they were grieving the triumph of their own egos, if I were to be really honest. They were grieving the triumph of their nursing of their hurts, of their offenses, of these lines that had been crossed that were stronger than their love of God or family. Stronger than their desire to be in each other's lives. Stronger even than their desire to be able to show up at each other's memorial services at some point in the future. I remember I was visiting a woman who was living in Aegis, and she was so excited. She wanted to talk to me. She scheduled a meeting with me, and she said, "My sister called me the other day." And I said, "Cool." She said, no, you don't understand. My sister, who I have not spoken to in 30 years, called me the other day. And I said, "Whoa, tell me about that." And she said, yeah, she had been going through some of her stuff, and she found a photo of us with our dad. And our dad was the reason that we had had such a split, because when he had died, it had been a real catastrophe. All kinds of mess and shenanigans and tomfoolery and nuttiness, and it had split them apart, and they had not spoken to each other. And she said, yeah, we talked for 4 hours, and at the end of it, we couldn't remember exactly why we were so mad at each other. But what's that thing that Maya Angelou says? People won't remember what you say, they'll remember how you made them feel. And that feeling became a narrative, right? Because feelings last how long? 90 seconds, minute and a half. But a narrative is sticky, right? It's meaning. All of a sudden, that person is a bad person, that person is a disrespectful person, that person is unkind, that person's a threat, that person's blah, 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 blah. And that sticks around even when the feeling's gone. And this woman only lived like another year and a half, I think, but she lived the last year and a half of her life with a sister. And she lived 30 years without one. And I just think so much about how we just get in our own way, and that death can sometimes really clarify who we are and who we're not. And I think about that family and that death clarifying that they were not big enough. They couldn't imagine a future where they're in a relationship, that this woman was their future. And I'm not saying anything about them, I'm just saying for me, I know that having an identity in Jesus Christ allows me to always have a future. Because I am located in him, I am rooted in him, I am called forth in him, that no matter what happens in my life, no matter what shenanigans and tomfoolery happen amongst people, I have a future, and because I am a beloved child of God and you are a beloved child of God, we can figure out a way. I need to believe that. I'm going to proclaim the sovereignty of God over that, whether I feel it or not. I think our nation has some challenges around this stuff right now, big time. And I think sometimes a death reminds us that we are grieving the wrong we. That sometimes a loss, a profound shift, an end to something, and we grieve it and we realize, man, maybe I'm grieving the wrong we. That maybe the thing that I've lost, that was too important to me. That my identity was rooted in it. My identity was rooted in being her son instead of being a child of God. That I think sometimes we have lost our ability to trust that God is in all of it. And we think that maybe God was maybe in part of it, but like here we are now facing a future where God isn't. Where there are limited possibilities, where there's only so many outcomes here, and this thing that was going to secure our future is gone now, and we don't have a future anymore. I think sometimes the death reminds us that we have grounded ourselves in the wrong we, and that there's a greater we in us. I believe that having an identity in Jesus Christ means we can grieve everything. We can lose everything. We can release everything and still have a future, because we will always have a future in Christ. There's always possibility in the love of God to transform anything. And I think the more that we can make ourselves ready to be made ready for the possibility that we will need to proclaim a future in the midst of chaos, we will need to proclaim a hope in the midst of fear, we will need to proclaim a love in the midst of hate. He needs us for this. He needs us for this, to not get distracted, to not get caught up, to not identify ourselves with some movement or some theory or some particular organizing structure, but to align ourselves with the sovereignty of God and proclaim, no matter what's happening down here right now, no matter how this is laid out right here, I have a future and a hope in Jesus Christ. And that future and that hope is always going to be oriented towards the dignity and worth of all people, the love and respect, and the liberation and freedom that I have found. We start with us. We trust in God, and we move forward in faith. It's the same today as it was last week, as it will be next year.